So you're the one that's busting your arse, turning up every day. I can remember doing 600 days without a break, 18 hours a day. That's a fact, didn't you? But yeah, like you said, that's not right, is it? So why are you only getting a fraction? And then you've got someone that's already given away 25% of the business. I'm sorry, but I was having there's red flags all over the place with that, and that's just my opinion.
No, it's true. And then when I approached them about the situation, they try to play,
And I think that's what they were doing. They were
try to
like,
you know what I'm saying? Like,
and that
it's
might
just
sound a bit
bullshit to
odd
me.
and crazy, but if you
Some of
look
that's
at
not
something
right.
like
I don't know.
age free, I don't know if listeners will know age free. It's in Wiltshire in England, and it's the largest pond in the world, 450 yards across or whatever. And nobody knows what it is. You've got this enormous great circle, and it has like an axis across the west, it has an axis north south, and the equator east west, and it's leaning about 22.5 degrees from due north. And when you fly over it, as I did in a light aircraft, it just struck me as being pretty obvious what this thing is.
Park my Eve here in this project, because I know that, they're building.
Now, people can't imagine that. I think one of your helpers said that they would put up a PDF on your site with some of the images that explain that. Yeah, so if they go onto your website, have a look at the PDF, you will see an image of it between the Avery and the actual sort of outline of Europe. And I think that's what they were actually for. During the megalithic era, whenever that was. They were drawing the shape of the earth, tracing the correct angle of the tilt angle of the earth, more or less correct. And I think that's what they were for. Right, we're going to take a quick break and come back and take phone calls with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast. Find out more about tonight's guest. Log on to coasttocoastam.com.
Yes, it's ignorance, lack of research. And not so much as being selfish, they're so ambitious to build something that they go about it the wrong way. They want to build
I'm glad that I'm here to raise and whoever's listening can actually understand where I'm coming from.
Doesn't matter why you're moving or maybe even inherited a home, and now what do you do? Usually you go to a real estate agent, speak with them, and you're told to clean and paint and repair, and buyers are going to walk through the house that's pristine, as if you don't live there, they'll use that. How about getting a fair price for your home without any of that hassle? DirectBuyers.com will do exactly that. DirectBuyers.com, a local family-owned business, Janet and Matt, brother and sister. I love the way they. Now, there are a lot of schmucks out there in this business. I would suggest you call DirectBuyers.com. They'll never lowball you. They'll give you an honest, no-obligation offer, even a $15,000 cash advance before closing. Go to
Gosh, look at this one.
Call 844-242-SELL. 844-242-SELL. DirectBuyers.com. Never give out your Medicare. They're going to get your number for a false claim. Just hang up. You can track Medicare fraud. Just like I check my credit card statements, I check my Medicare statements monthly.
What about this? And they included a completely different way. And all of them
Report Medicare fraud. Call 855-613-7080. On the podcast Really Know Really, join best friends Jason Alexander and Peter Silton, along with experts, newsmakers, and celebrities, in a search for answers to life's most baffling, intriguing, and annoying questions. Those things that make you go, really? Now, really? I think there was a 17-year-old in Rhode Island who ran a candidate as quick as a difference. Really? That's news to me. That's really no really right there. Really no really. Listen to Really No Really on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcast. And you find AM 640. Untangling the mess until it makes sense. You are in the home stretch. Here's Jennifer Jones Lee with your Friday morning wake-up call.
Let's do this, people. Woo! If you don't forget. I woke up this morning like, yeah, it's Friday. And I thought, yeah, it's Friday, and I've been doing absolutely nothing this weekend. Then I thought to myself, maybe that's why I'm so excited. It's gonna be good. At the farmer's market and some hummus in my future. By the way, you've never been to the Rancho Cucamonga farmer's market? That's in the Target Shopping Center on Foothill and Haven. Oh, okay, the hummus there. So I think it's called Three Brothers or something like that, brother. Anyway, maybe I'm just excited about that. Maybe I'm excited about the fact that I was still getting cookies at Mr. Baker's afterwards. Or maybe I'm just excited that I get to sleep in. Either way, we do not have rain in the forecast through at least Saturday. So you've got a beautiful weekend coming up. Hopefully dry out a little bit. Clean up that backyard that's probably a mess. So it's going to be a good weekend. I can feel it. Here's what's ahead on your wake-up call. The National Guard and other responders have arrived in the San Bernardino Mountains to help people who have been stuck in their homes under several feet of snow. LAX says it's expecting one of the busiest spring break travel periods since 2019. And there's a new survey that shows 1 in 5 people in the U.S. want to be like that and live in LA.
Yeah, we'll talk about in the back.
505 will talk politics with ABC News political director Rick Klein. We're going to get into CPAC. Who's there? Who's not there? Where the who's not there are going. Also, we'll talk about the president meeting with members of his own party yesterday. Chuck Schumer all smiles after meeting up with the president. And George Santos. I don't think he was smiling. He's facing an investigative subcommittee. So, I guess I knew that there were subcommittees before the committees, but doesn't it feel like, well, we have to vote on whether we're going to vote to investigate the guy? Yeah, it feels very preliminary, but I guess we got to start somewhere. We'll get into all of that with Rick in just a few minutes, but let's update what's going on in the San Bernardino Mountains. National Guard and other responders have arrived in the San Bernardino Mountains to help people who have been stuck in their homes under several feet of snow. It's giant for spaces of early in the mountain community east of Los Angeles, where back-to-back storms jumped up to 7 feet of snow. Oh, it blew the right out of it. Some areas of San Bernardino County have been cut off for 10 days. That's ABC Ryan Marie, who says there's some firefighters could be seen yesterday preparing a helicopter to deliver ready-to-eat meals. People in Crestline, Lake Arrowhead, Running Springs, and other communities have reported running low on food for necessities. Crestline lost its only grocery store when the roof collapsed. Now, it's not that the wind of the snow that came coast in some mountain communities. That's the gas lines have caused explosions. I remember what hurt when something blew up.
Going back through the bedroom door, knocking the bedroom door off of the injured.
The man has burns on his face and chest. Now, at 10 o'clock this morning, they are supposed to do another news conference to give an update on what's happening in the San Bernardino Mountains and how they are trying to get to those people and help them out. CFI's Lake Joey is in San Bernardino, and he will bring us the latest on that when that news conference happens. Again, that's at 10 o'clock. Did you know some other experts say using battery charges are charged better when it's hot? So this last week of cold weather storms means EV drivers have been waiting longer to get a charge, and their batteries stop charging well below capacity. So this is one more reason why I am all for electric cars. When we get the infrastructure there, and that includes, I guess, my hope that we get better handle on making even the cars work efficiently. So even the
You guys
cheapest
know,
imported
man.
cars is
That was
not
cool.
quite there yet.
And then what?
That's when I see some of these
Yeah, this one, yo.
All electric cars by a certain year is $10. I say I'm all
Yeah.
for that. I'm behind that 100%. Just show me your map that we have the infrastructure to go along with that lofty goal. And I'll sign up. All right, we come back. We are going to talk with ABC Political Director Rick Klein all about what's going on this week. Who's it? Who's not? And also George Santos and a little investigative subcommittee that's looking into him. Right now, it's good morning and happy Friday to Nick Valiotine. Political Director Rick Klein joins us now. Rick, good morning. So, on one side, we can look at the people who are.
Remember you were such a pimp? No, we weren't discussing it. I was a pimp. I'm still a pimp. Never stopped being a pimp. They once put a gun in my head and they said, "Motherfucker, you can either die or stop being a pimp." And I was like, "Baby." Kill me. That's how we got here. So did you have to stop being a pimp? Yeah, she better go. So you have to stop being a pimp. Maybe you remember any time story about being a pimp? Really? Yeah. Right. Oh, that was a really good story about you. When you were like pizza poop. I loved it. I loved it. I still love pizza poop. Oh, dog. And then you just fucked it up. Fucked it. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Oh, fuck. Oh, shit. Why isn't that one picture? It's disgusting. What the fuck is that? She said, I don't fucking know. That's some real friends. Alright. Are you done? Jim! I'm like, oh, shout out to the biggest pimp of all time, Mikey. Thank you so much, Rick. We'll talk to you again soon. Rick Klein, ABC Political Director, and also the host of this week of the Beyond on Sunday.
California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein is in the hospital in San Francisco. She's being treated for shingles. It's a viral infection that causes a painful rash. ABC's Ann Flaherty says Feinstein's office put out a short statement saying the 89-year-old six-term senator was diagnosed last month but is expected to make a full recovery. According to reporters, she said she hopes to return to the Senate later this month. Feinstein is the oldest-serving member of the U.S. Senate. With thousands of people in LA have gathered for a celebration of life for Bishop David O'Connell, who was killed at his home. Bishop was started at his prison house in the heights where O'Connell lived. Members of the Bishop's family
Twitter sucks. Are you done? Hey, Twitter sucks. You guys should be like, remember when you were telling this story about Twitter sucks? While you were on Twitter, streaming Twitter, closing. That was just about Twitter. Grabbing your heavy shirt. Bitching about Twitter. Oh, damn it, motherfucker. Get over here. Let's get this over with, you fucking cunt. Yo, dog. Yo, dog. Are we just randomly listening to iHeartRadio? Yo, dog. Yo, dog. This is... My phone's so fucked up right now. What is playing? What is this? What happens to it? Oh, why did that show? I don't know. That made people go, is that it was a wild child who from Islamic apparently for the woman in LA who filed the lawsuit about Harvey Weinstein, they need the court help to get wow, this is a weird one. Transsexual fucking a chick. They should be okay with this. I'm really beat up, bro. It's still not my thing. But y'all can move the thing. I don't know, I never had it. I'm a big fan of brand.
seems to be the river here coming to you and delivering world-class service. That farm was set for number is in the back of every river door coming to the place. Call us at 866-477 and we'll even your lines for $77. That's 866-477. Thank you. This report is sponsored by BlindStore.com. If you're many people, you may just cut the blinds as a job for expensive professionals. For a blind store, if you have a technology screwdriver, you can install a custom blinds and trade bill. Plus, you guarantee that's it. BlindStore.com. Presented by Mercury Farms. Slippers of last four sprinkles after falling to the water. They were right back out and nice with the change. Everything will be integrated back with nice hands and put to the roll. Number 4, UCLA men's basketball top scorers on the state. USC's got 35 points from the Raptors. Coaches to the number 9 Arizona. An accessible 5 freeway has been renamed to a positive photo project. This family takes turns turning lives. Friends, beauty, and a water children. All they need now is for you to drive home off the lot. The Mercedes-Benz family of SUVs. A family of unrivaled vehicles voting with their local dealer. On the podcast, the last silver, last fast, and fun. More developed styling for I cannot turn in my car. That's true. And tells the story of the final Cosmo. A man passing through while his mate tumbled to the ground.
Good morning. It's so good. With the favorite podcast and one of the world's only places. A flower of joy at the new accents.
Listen to the last program on the iHeartRadio app or wherever with a hip-hop app. Hey, it's Jennifer. Join us this March to Make March Matter for Children's Hospital Los Angeles. Make March Matter makes amazing things happen for sick kids. It's a month-long event that takes place right in your neighborhood. So every time you shop, family, or attend an event with a participating partner, there are donate funds to support Children's Hospital Los Angeles. It's your children to give and saving lives is everyone's business. For more information, visit makemarchmatter.org. That's makemarchmatter.org. Seriously, there's just that expectation.
You go to the wrong place for transmission repair. You need a local business to transmission is the most complex part of this program. So bring to the transmission expert at Retail. Money is the right fit. The air, and the sea. Simplifying the future. The systems one agency speaking at likeforlike.com to be detailed. Likeforlike systems is the culture of electric water straight from every tap in the house. It filters out the chlorine and contaminants while retaining healthy minerals and their filters are sustainable.
Are we done? Alright, today. Bye. Everybody, defect. I smile. I'm sure that's really. Why? How about the bathroom? Or somebody that can shoot. That might be cool, right? Because I know everybody's got the really cool. And then I have this motherfucker hat up. Fucking guards in Buckingham Palace. It's like, holy fuck. Yoshi, what was this fucking thing? left. Eating everyone by Joe. Joe? Oh my god, I was remembering the morning. Good morning, Click. Go to bed. Oh my god. It's been a long day. Look at this, President. Hey, dog. Gosh, man. Remember when you were talking about the thing? And it was like, okay, what's a bad guy's thing? Huh? We're gonna fight. Tokyo. No, dog, that wasn't on it. Yoshi. What? No. Podcast and creative. What creative? Yoshi. God damn it, it's fine, whatever, dog. Oh my Christ. Stop the fuck. Yo. These two guys are the same motherfucker. That's not good. Had it work with a motherfucker. Now you don't do anything. I work at one Francis Drake. That motherfucker's interesting. I'm like this motherfucker. I'm a freaking enemy. Should I never go and kiss my fucking ass, dog? I love his stars. So cool. Go should watch this movie. Yoshi. Remember when it was doing both? Which one did you want? Yoshi. Oh, and then it was like, no. Dude, this is the dumbest fucking thing I've ever seen. Like on Mrs. Rocky. Oh, yes, right.
That's surveymonkey.com/r/airwaves, or click on the link in our episode notes of our more recent episodes. There's also a link on our website's homepage, explorespodcast.com. Thank you again for your help.
Josh, do you think you're the best of all the
Yeah, well, that's what you're saying.
I don't think it's not. But it's you. I mean, I would have bought that monkey.
Every episode is
Really? I would have bought that monkey.
whether it's the game of the birds, or the people's landing and they do listen to their listen and subscribe to this page and this video.
Hello, and welcome to the Explorers Podcast. Today we are going down a path I have not ventured until now, and that is an interview. I've had lots of opportunities to interview people on this show, but I have not pulled the trigger. However, I got the chance to read a new book, Everest 1922, the epic story of the first attempt on the world's highest mountain by writer and filmmaker Nick Confrey. I decided to do an interview because after covering George Mallory and then Hillary Tenzing about a year and a half ago, I fell in love with these stories, and I just wanted to learn more and share that stuff with you guys. So, some background for today's podcast. Nick Confrey is a filmmaker and writer from England. He has done all sorts of documentaries for the BBC and local TV, mostly about mountaineering. He's also written several books, including looks at the first descents of Everest and K2. As noted, his latest book is Everest 1922, looking at the first attempt on the world's highest mountain. It's a great read. I love the detail Mick provides in the book about the people, events leading up and the expedition itself. Despite reading a ton of books about this era, I learned so much. Everest 1922 is full of all sorts of fun stories and details about the expedition, and it really expands on the episodes we did on the show about George Mallory. Mick's new book is available now, and I very much recommend it. I have put links to the book in our show notes, as well as on our website, explorerspodcast.com. These early attempts on Everest, plus a whole lot more. So I hope you enjoyed this wide range of discussion. Otherwise, that's it. Review with Nick Confrey, the author of the new book, Everest 1922. Alrighty, today we are here with Nick Confrey. He is the author of the new book, Everest 1922, about the first coordinated effort to climb Mount Everest. Nick, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. We just covered a lot of this territory about a year ago on the show, and I loved it. I learned so much. And when your book came out, it's literally being released like right now, and I got a chance to read it, and I would have loved to have had it during my own series that I did. But I just wanted to do more on this because this is a subject that I think that we are so missing a lot of the great stories of. And I read your book, and it was just like, okay, this is something that'll be really interesting. The book covers the initial attempts to climb Everest in 1922. It also covers the 1921 reconnaissance expedition, things we covered in our series on George Mallory too. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating is the mindset and the world of these people coming out of probably the most cataclysmic event in world history to Europe, World War I, and kind of talk about how the Great War affected them.
Well, the question is, did the Great War affect them? I mean, that's a kind of assumption, and I think that obviously there's another very good book, Wade Davis's Into the Silence, which very much is about the idea that these characters are very much influenced by their wartime experience and their particular attitude to risk, for example. And I do understand that, and I can see where that's coming from. But I'm not necessarily sure that I would agree with it, because if you actually look at the composition of the actual team, that sure, most of them were soldiers and or had served at some point during the First World War, but several of them were professional soldiers who had begun soldiering before the First World War. And so, for example, Charlie Bruce, the leader of the expedition, Geoffrey Bruce, his nephew, Edward Norton, they were career soldiers who had been in the army before the First World War. And any soldier who had served on the northwest frontier, the border of India and Afghanistan, would have been, arguably to a greater extent than people who've been in the Great War to an equal extent. And so their experience that they brought to it wasn't just the experience of being in the trenches in World War I, it was of being professional soldiers beforehand. And if you look at the early history of Everest before the First World War, it is professional soldiers who are involved in it. You know, the first kind of recorded incident where people say, hey, let's go and climb Everest, is Charles Bruce and Frances Young husband, who were both soldiers in the 1890s. The first person who gets into Tibet and gets close enough to see Everest is John Knoll, who is again another professional soldier working for the British Army in British India. And this is before the First World War. So the soldiering and mountaineering, particularly in the Himalayas, were connected because the only people who got access to the Himalayas, the only people who got anywhere close to it, a lot of those people were soldiers. And if you were, so say somebody like Geoffrey Bruce and then Charles Bruce, that they became, they weren't, well, Geoffrey Bruce wasn't really a mountaineer at all, you know. He was initially taken on as a transport officer, but eventually took part in one of the summit attempts in 1922, and he was able to do that because he'd been toughened up by operating at high altitude as a soldier patrolling the northwest frontier, you know, in the modern day Karakoram Mountains. So I think that, you know, first of all, there is a strong connection between soldiering and mountaineering, but it's not just because of the First World War. And, you know, it seems to me that mountaineering has always been about taking risks. And if you go back to the earliest expeditions in the Himalayas, the first attempt on K2, the first attempt on Kanchenjunga, the first attempt on Nanga Parbat, which was in the 1890s, that people were taking risks then, and they knew that going to the Himalayas meant taking bigger risks. And so I would sort of disagree with the thesis that because of the First World War, people came out and had a different attitude towards risk, because I think there were expeditions before the First World War and they were fundamentally different to how they carried it out in the 1920s.
Excellent. That's awesome. You talk about some of these people involved in the expedition, Charles Bruce, and obviously everyone knows George Mallory and stuff like that. They have some characters on this thing. Bruce being one of the interesting men of the era, I think, has a little bit of a Teddy Roosevelt kind of swagger to him, where he just can sit with the Sherpas and drink with them and have fun and then still command everything. Who are some of your favorite characters from these early expeditions?
Yeah, well, I would very much agree. I mean, I think that they, you know, the sort of people who are drawn to this world are often a little bit eccentric, you know, and the people who are drawn to the Himalayas were frequently sort of interested in the Orient and enjoyed meeting, you know, Tibetan and culture and Indian culture and Chinese culture. And kind of often quite larger than life. And I mean, I think that Charles Bruce was literally larger than life. He was slightly overweight. He used to joke that his liver was so big that it needed two people to carry it. Before he went on the expedition, he had to endure a medical exam. The examiner came out by, you know, with this kind of list of wounds and kind of damage to his body, and in spite of all of that, he was still deemed to be fighting fit. He was a very charismatic leader who clearly enjoyed working with Sherpas and Tibetan people and Nepalese. And so he genuinely enjoyed it. And so it was kind of easy for him to be the leader of the porters. And it was crucial for the British expedition to have the porters on the side, because they were the people who were going to carry the stuff up the mountain. And so their morale was really important. And what was great about Bruce was he genuinely liked them. He genuinely could speak their language. He genuinely enjoyed mucking around with them. They were his kind of guys. These are Sherpas and Boshis and Tibetans were quite macho kind of people, and also quite playful as well. And he really liked that. So I think that General Bruce is a kind of, you know, great character. George Mallory is a completely different, very interesting character, very artistic. You know, his background is He'd been at Cambridge. His friends were bohemian artists, and so he had a completely different side to him. He was famously painted by Duncan Grant, a British artist. His friends included people in what they call the Bloomsbury set. And so he brought a completely different kind of sensibility to it, and was a complex, rich, and interesting character. George Finch, the Australian, who was the team's de facto oxygen expert, completely different. From he was the only person on the expedition who wasn't British. He was a scientist, had a completely different mindset, a completely different way of approaching things. So, whereas, for example, Mallory was very chaotic and was always losing things and wasn't very good with technology. And you put the plates in the plate camera in the wrong way round. He was famous for forgetting things. He was really hopeless with equipment. Finch was the opposite. He was really good with equipment. He was very methodical. He was very systematic. He's the only person on the expedition who had some purpose-built clothing made for him beforehand, which was the precursor of the modern-day down suit. He worked out a way of putting a rubber coating on top of his maps so that they would be water and wind resistant. He took a lot of photographs. He developed his own film. He was very methodical and indeed also a very, very good climber. So what's so interesting about the 1922 expedition is the range of people. They're mainly pucker British chaps who've been to public school and either into the army or to Oxford and Cambridge, but they're not all like that. It's the Mallorys and it's the Finches and it's the Bruces who make it really rich and interesting, because there's something very idiosyncratic about it.
When I did the Mallory series, I touched on this reputation he has as being kind of, like you said, chaotic and forgetful and stuff. And I don't know if I emphasized it enough, but it'll drive people crazy sometimes with his just flightiness, I guess, or whatever. But like you said, Finch is the opposite. Yet they were both considered some of the finest climbers of their day. Now, Finch and Mallory did not necessarily get along. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say that was true. I think that in fact Mallory really saw Finch as a rival. Mallory was a kind of complex character. He was very ambitious, but at the same time was quite generous to other people. And Mallory, for example, never became the leader on any of the expeditions. But at the same time, he clearly wanted to be the first person to climb Everest. And I think that if you look at his diary, there's quite often quite little barbed comments about George Finch. He was quite critical of it. And I do think he saw him as a bit of a rival. And I think Finch probably saw Mallory as a rival as well. I think Finch was envious of Mallory. Mallory was a golden boy of the British establishment. Everybody loved him. Everybody thought he was a great climber. Finch had learned his climbing living in Switzerland. He had gone to school in Zurich, I think it was, and he learned his mountaineering living on the continent. And so it's undoubtedly, I think, the case that he was a much better snow climber. That he had experience of doing a lot of alpine climbing. Mallory had done some alpine climbing, but he'd also done a lot of rock climbing in North Wales. So, arguably, they were both at the top of their game, and there was a little friction between them. And afterwards, when they came to lecture about the expedition, they were very much pitted against each other and the people who promoted the lectures. And they specifically had them arguing about oxygen, whether it was valid or invalid to use oxygen on Everest. And because Finch, although he in some respects didn't actually initiate much the team's oxygen export, and Mallory in 1922 at least was very against oxygen, and he famously called it a damnable heresy, and thought it was, and agreed with the sort of line that it wasn't sporting, it wasn't aesthetic to climb with oxygen, whereas Finch was a much more scientific, pragmatic sort of person and said, look, if oxygen is going to get us to the top more quickly or make it possible, then we've got to go for it. It's stupid not to. It's scientific to see the benefits of oxygen. So very much Mallory was oxygen guy, Finch was the oxygen guy, and so they were kind of pitted against each other during and after the expedition. So that added to that little bit of rivalry. They were both top climbers and wanted to be the first person to get to the top.
With regard to oxygen and anything else on the expedition, what were the key issues that you saw that came up in there that really made for good drama, or just really key points? What were the things that happened and issues that cropped up?
I think the thing about the 1942 expedition was it was the first expedition, first attempt. You know, there had been a reconnaissance in the previous year, and so it was quite hyped up. You know, in Britain, they spend a lot of time trying to raise money, and the way that they raised money was to say this was going to be a great thing, and if you could step onto the top of Everest, it would be great for the whole of humanity, and it was a little bit like the kind of one small step for a man, one huge step for mankind. That all of that rhetoric, and so when they went out there, they definitely took with them a kind of pressure to succeed. And that definitely, to an extent, informed what happened. For example, the 1922 expedition ended with a disaster when there was an avalanche and it killed 7 porters. Now, really, they shouldn't have made a third attempt. Everybody knew they shouldn't have made a third attempt. Charles Bruce certainly knew that. And because it was clear that they were all exhausted, the weather was turning, and it was just a dangerous thing to do. It shouldn't really have been done. But the reason why Charles Bruce, as the expedition leader, said yes to Mallory, when Mallory suggested let's try for a third time, was that in the back of his mind he's thinking, well, all the organisers back home want me to come back with success, and you know, although we've done really well with the first attempt, we haven't got to the top. So if we can give it one more shot, then who am I to say no to George Mallory? I think probably was what was going through his mind, didn't it? This was certainly a sort of British drama, and they felt that, and a global drama. They'd sold the story around the world. You know, that they felt this kind of thing. You know, we've got to succeed here, and that's obviously so different from a sort of modern Everest climb 100 years later, where it could be just as dramatic, but it's generally a personal drama. You know, you have kind of decided that your life's ambition is to get to the top of Everest. You sign up with a team, which you're going there, and if you get to the top, that's great, but it's not as if the rest of the world cares, really. This is your personal drama. Your friends, your family, your immediate circle might care about it, but there's not going to write about it on the front of the Times because it's been done before, whereas in 1922 it hadn't been done before. And the people had been selected, a team had been formed, letters had been sent out to raise money, you know, events had been held to raise money. There's a lot of expectation there, and that's what makes it, that's why people have forced themselves to do things which perhaps are against their better judgment, you know. And that's what, you know, drama is what happens, isn't it, when people are under pressure. And that's why exploration is interesting, because people are under pressure, and it's how do you react when you're under pressure, you know. So people are pushing themselves a bit harder than they should do, that, and they're making decisions based on what they hope the outcome is going to be, rather than necessarily what their better judgment is.
I don't want to obsess on Mallory, because I think we obsess on Mallory a lot. It's easy to. He was described as being obsessive at times about climbing Everest. Was he? Did you see that, or was it just like all the others, and we just kind of latch onto it because it makes for a good story?
I think that Mallory was obsessive about mountaineering, but he also had other interests in his life, and so he was quite conflicted at certain points about whether he should go to Everest or not. Not in 1922, but in 1924, he definitely had an ambivalence as to whether he should go there. He had just started a new job. He believed passionately in education, particularly for workers. He had just started working on a new job where he was lecturing to workers in the evening, and also he had a wife and 2 children. And so I think that it was a real tussle for him, deciding would he go to Everest for a third time in 1924. In 1922, that I think he definitely wanted to go, and it's also he wasn't really interested in anything else other than climbing, you know, that whereas other members of the team were quite interested in finding out about local culture and would want to go to the temples and would be interested in Buddhism and would be interested in Tibetan life. Mallory just wasn't interested at all, in spite of the fact that he came from a kind of artistic background and had friends who were painters and friends who were writers. When it came to being on locations in the Himalayas, all he wanted to do was climb. And so even before the main attempt on Everest gets underway, he tries a smaller mountain called Sangaree. And then when it came to Everest, he was very focused on wanting to get to the top. So I think very much he's obsessive in the sense that once he's there, all he wants to do is climb, and all he wants to do is get to the top of Everest. But when he's not there, he's got another quite rich life. And so he's torn between his different desires, and that's what makes him interesting, you know. So he certainly was in 1924 very ambivalent as to whether he should go there or not, you know, and eventually he decided he had to, you know, but that was a struggle for him.
I want to touch on modern Everest. The very first thing I think you talk about in your book, and that is today climbing Everest is almost like a corporate thing, or it's like a 2-week excursion, you know, and you pay $50,000 or whatever. They fly it here, and they do this. And have we lost some of that understanding of how incredibly hard and known this was 100 years ago, even 50 or 60 years ago when Tenzing and Hillary did it? What is the really huge thing that you see that's different that you think people don't necessarily realize today about what it was 100 years ago?
I think it's just that sense of absolutely going into the unknown. In 1921, when the reconnaissance happened, there wasn't a map. There wasn't even a map of Everest. When they got close to Everest, a lot of local people weren't that interested. And so, for example, there were 2 different mountains which they called Chomolungma, and it was a question of which one, you know. And so you really were walking off the map. And also, nobody had any idea whether you could survive at high altitude. The opinions were very contradictory. And so there was a real sense of risk and of the unknown. Whereas now everybody knows you can get to the top of Everest. And if you're an elite mountaineer, then you might want to get to the top of Everest under your own steam, not using oxygen. If you're somebody who doesn't consider themselves an elite mountaineer, you would invariably use oxygen because it makes it possible in a way that removes some of the risk to it. So, and again, I come back to that thing that, you know, in the 1920s, it was a public event. It was an international event which everybody was interested in. It wasn't possible for it to be your own private drama because as a private individual, you couldn't go there. It took years, decades, just to negotiate passage through Tibet to get to Everest. Most people now climb Everest from Nepal. Until 1949, 48, 49, you couldn't get into Nepal. Nobody could. So now everything is kind of easy, you know, up to a point, but at the same time, it's still very easy to get killed on Everest because it's a very dangerous place. And if things go wrong, they frequently go cataclysmically wrong. So the risk has been mitigated, but it's still very hard.
Well, there's I think over 100 bodies on Everest today that have been left there. With the amount of people, and then you see trash and things like that. Do you see any sort of regulation or anything that could be done to alleviate that things, or is it just too much of a business now that they're just going to keep queuing people up the hill and letting them go?
If you look at Mount Denali and McKinley as it once was, there's a lot of regulation there now, and people have to take their trash out. People have to take out their excrement. So it is possible, if you have a rigorous policy, you can force people to leave the mountain in a very clean condition. But obviously it's a slightly different situation in Nepal and Tibet, where there is a greater economic need to have the largest possible number of people going there, and less money to kind of to ensure that they leave it in a clean condition. But I think people exaggerate how dirty it is. I mean, since the I can't remember when it was, 1980s, maybe 1990s, there have been several Everest cleanup expeditions. Sure, it may be the case that there are a certain number of corpses high on the mountain. The reason why they're not taken away is not because people are kind of, they're not a sense of litter, but they're just, it's quite dangerous to do that. And so there's a sort of difference between the waste which is left, which is simply, which is litter really, and people being lazy, and things where it would be very difficult to bring a corpse down, you know, and or it would be dangerous, and you're having to work out dangers outweigh the benefits, you know. So but as I say, I think on the other hand, I think people do exaggerate how bad it is. When I went to Everest Base Camp, for example, 20 years ago, it wasn't dirty, you know, there wasn't a massive amount of litter around, and definitely both the Nepali and the Chinese Tibetan government, you know, they're aware of this, and I think it will gradually get better, you know. So yeah, you know, it's not as bad as people say it is, I don't think.
Prepare to enter an immersive world of tragedies, hauntings, legends, and folklore. Southern Gothic is a podcast that will take you deep into the dark history and haunted lore of the American South, exploring some of the region's most infamous tales, from the swamps of Louisiana to the shores of the Carolinas, isolated communities of Appalachia, and the bloody battlefields and earliest settlements of Virginia. This is where ghost stories come alive, grim secrets are exposed, and mysteries, well, you need to listen to find out. Join us now at southerngothicmedia.com, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey Matt, did you know that wombats poop cubes?
Nope, never heard that before.
Did you know the unicorn is the national animal of Scotland, Ken?
I didn't know, nor do I care.
Neil, did you know that Liechtenstein is the only doubly landlocked country in Europe?
Jeff, isn't that an American pop artist?
Well, actually, it's both. If you want to learn things like that and more, join us each week on Triviality, a pub trivia-style game show podcast where a lack of seriousness meets a little bit of knowledge.
Listen in each week to answer general knowledge trivia alongside exciting guests from around the world.
And we're here too.
Join us every Tuesday for new hour-long episodes of Triviality, plus tons of extra themed content on everything from The Office and Lord of the Rings to science and geography.
And sometimes we even do sports.
Find us on all your preferred podcast apps and take part in the fun of playing bar trivia without the need to wear pants.
Real mature, Jeff. Forget it, Neil. It's Triviality.
What attracted you to do this latest book, the Everest 1922? I had made a lot of documentaries for the BBC about mountaineering and exploration, and so the first reason why I wrote books, I wrote a book about the Everest 1953 expedition, was because whilst making the documentary, we both gathered a lot of research information which we couldn't put into an hour-long film. But it also surprised me that there hadn't really been very much written about it. In the 1950s, there were lots of books by the official expedition accounts and Edmund Hillary and Tenzing, but between the 1950s and the year 2000, there were no books at all written about it. It was included in lots of bigger books about the Himalayas or bigger books about Everest. Within the expeditions of the 1920s, in my latest book, Everest 22, this was slightly more familiar ground. There have been lots of people who've written a lot of kind of probably the most famous character involved in the Everest story. But strangely again, it struck me that the 1922 expedition had been slightly ignored because everybody was just interested in what happened 2 years later in 1924 when Mallory and Irving may or may not have got to the summit. and they weren't really interested in the precursor expedition. And so I thought, well, this is a little bit strange. And obviously, with it being the 100th anniversary this year, it's a good opportunity to take stock and say, well, what is different today to how it was then, but also to kind of give a fairly detailed account of what happened in 1922. And because the from the 20s were very, very different from the characters from the 1950s. They share some similarities, but the post-war team who made the first attempt were very different from the kind of Packer English chaps of the 1920s. And so that made it interesting to me.
You mentioned the 1953 people expedition, and you said they're very different people. Those obvious differences, they have a Sherpa and a New Zealander going up onto the top of the mountain, while everyone else back in 1922 and 24 was British, save for Finch. What else was, you talked about how different, what else about those guys that was so different about the approach and things like that, that let them succeed as well?
As you say, the crucial difference in the 1950s was Tenzing, and Tenzing, that being said, was an exceptional character. And in the 1920s, the idea that a Sherpa might have accompanied him to the summit would have been inconceivable, because at that stage, the local people of the Himalayas just weren't interested in mountaineering at all, and so they were tough characters, and who were used to working at heights, but would never have had the time or the resources to have gone mountaineering for sport. But by the 50s, that's a change, and there'd been enough Sherpas and Tibetans on expeditions for them to both get very good at it technically, and also to, in the case of Tenzing, to actually want to be part of it. He was very different from most other people, and he actually wanted to climb Everest. None of the Sherpas in the 1920s, they did it because they were earning money, and they enjoyed it. They liked the British because they were quite, they were all, as I say, quite macho characters. They enjoyed the camaraderie of it, but fundamentally they did it for money. They were poor people, and somebody comes along and says, if you carry this load for me, we'll pay you a lot of money, and so they say yes. So the changing role of the Sherpas is very significant. From the 1920s, quite a few of them are sort of Victorian. Charles Bruce is a Victorian character. Francis Younghusband, the person who was the head of the Everest Committee, was a Victorian character. So they're really taking you back into an earlier era of the British Empire, the British being in charge of India. By the 1950s, the empire was gone, and the influence was still there to an extent, but the British were no longer top dogs. Other countries were making attempts on Everest. In 1952, a Swiss team got very high on Everest. So there was now in the 50s, there was a sense of international competition, whereas really until the Second World War, everybody knew that no other foreign climber would ever get into Tibet, because the only people who had any power in the region were the British. And so American climbers might want to go to Everest, Germans might want to go to Everest, but they knew that they wouldn't get permission because they didn't have the diplomatic clout, was what it was really about. But certainly by the sensibility in the 50s also is different in the sense that there is an acceptance of the value of science, whereas in the 1920s there's a bit of ambivalence about it. On the expeditions of the 20s, George Finch was carrying the scientific banner saying, let's do this efficiently, let's have the warmest possible clothing, let's try and have oxygen equipment that works, let's do this, let's eat the right food, let's be all very rational about this. And everybody else is saying, well, hang on a minute, it's not quite sporting, and are you trying a little bit too hard, but by the 50s, there's an acceptance that, science works for us, and now we can have oxygen equipment which is relatively reliable. Now we're going to go there, but we're going to test every single tent available. We're going to develop new clothing. We're going to develop new climbing boots. We will be systematic in our approach to things. But that being said, after all of that, you've got to remember that in 1924, that Morton and Somerville got to 28,100 feet. They got to within 1,000 feet of the summit. You should never forget that they got very, very high. And even on the first attempt, they got to 27,000 feet. So for all the primitive equipment, for all the unsystematic approach that you could say they took, they still almost succeeded in 1924. You know, it's quite possible that Norton could have got to the top, but he didn't. You know, and he withdrew, realizing he couldn't quite make it that day.
Now, you touched on Tenzing. One of the great stories that I found out of the Everest, the 53 out of Tenzing story and stuff, was the almost like the reclaiming or the claiming of climbing status climbers by the Sherpas and the Nepali people and stuff like that. Till today, now they're not just the pack guys; they are climbers unparalleled in this world. I love that story, and you talk about it a little bit in the book. And just you mentioned some of the amazing things they've done already recently climbing, and I just wonder if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, what you have to remember is that in the 20s, right up to the 1950s, the European mountaineers and American mountaineers on K2, for example, felt it was very much their job to look after the Sherpas, you know, and that they would escort them from one camp to another. And whereas now it's the opposite way around on commercial expeditions, it's the Sherpas who are escorting the Europeans, you know, who feel a duty of care towards them. Certainly, they felt a duty of care towards the Sherpas and their Tibetan halters in the 20s up to the 1950s. And to a large extent, the Sherpas were not that interested in getting to the top. You know, famously, on the first ever ascent of an 8,000 meter peak, Annapurna in 1950, Ang Taki, who was considered again one of the very famous Sherpas, he was offered the opportunity to go to the summit, and he said no. He thought, why would I do this? And subsequently, it turned out that he did go to the summit, came back with very severe frostbite. So perhaps he wasn't kind of so stupid after all. You know, Tenzing is just different in the sense that he definitely wanted to get to the summit and thought of himself as an equal to any of the Europeans, you know, and then obviously today with Nims Purgel, who's not actually a Sherpa, he's from another Nepali, I can't quite remember the name of the ethnic group he's from, but he's another Nepali climber, and he has just done this awesome winter ascent of K2 with an all Nepali team. He's just climbed all the 8,000 meter peaks in record time. So there is no question that in Himalayan climbing now that Sherpas are, you know, some of the best climbers in the world, you know. So so they're no longer can just be considered assistants. But that being said, again, you know, the first ascent of K2 will almost happen in 1939. German-American climber Fritz Wiesner and his partner Hassan Dalai Lama was a Sherpa. So it was starting to change just before the Second World War, and then changed dramatically with the arrival of Tenzing in the 1950s. But really, it's only in the last 20 years that we've seen a very significant number of Sherpa climbers, and really it is kind of, you know, only even more recently that we've seen all Nepali climbing expeditions, and so that is a sea change.
You have a wide range of experience, as you said, you know, filmmaker, and you've done lots of stories on various different mountains. And what's the story that people don't realize is the greatest story out there? Everyone knows Mallory and Urban, and you know, and everyone knows Hillary. What's the story that is so good that I should be looking to do that on my show, that I should be talking about?
I mean, there's lots of great mountaineering stories. I mean, the thing about mountaineering literature is that a lot of it is what you might call painography. Certainly, if you look at Annapurna, the Morris Herzog book, or Touching the Void, the famous Joe Simpson book, it's all about suffering and how much I suffered, you know. And so in a funny kind of way, when people succeed, then often people think, oh, it's a little bit boring. And so to an extent, that was one of the feelings about the 1953 British Everest expedition was that, it was like a military operation. It all went successfully. It was like, all went like clockwork. But of course, anybody who knows anything about the military and military operations, well, sometimes they go supremely well, but frequently they go supremely badly. And in fact, there was much more tension in the 1953 Everest expedition than people think, and many more points where things could have gone wrong. But I think there are kind of thousands of stories out there. They're interesting in different ways. The story of the first ascent of McKinley of Denali is kind of fascinating and has very comical aspects to it, and the whole fakery of Frederick Cook pretending he got to the top, and then these strange characters, the sourdough miners who tell the world that they've got a kind of flagpole on the top of Denali, and then sort of realise they put it on the wrong peak because there was more than one peak, and then Hudson stuck the British missionary who succeeds, and so I think there's an awful lot of great story there. I can't say there's one desperately unknown one which
no problem. I just was, like I say, fishing for ideas too. But
well, then you should read The Last Blue Mountain. Amazing story. It's called The Last Blue Mountain. It's by an English journalist called Ralph. I can't remember his second name offhand. But it's the story of an attempt on a mountain in the Himalayas where everything goes absolutely disastrously wrong. Tremendous heroism involved and just kind of such terrible luck. So that's a great tale.
I always kind of realize, not always, but often realize some of the best stories we have are, as you said, they're tragedies. Even if you look at Shackleton's endurance stuff, I mean, literally nothing goes right. They get stuck in the ice. The ship sinks. They have to cross the ice. They have to cross the water. They have to cross the mountains. All that stuff should never have happened if things had gone well at the beginning. So it's a lot of times it's overcoming tragedy and things like that with these stories. I always have a great appreciation when explorers do things right. And, I talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition where they spent, 3-4 years going across the country, the United States and back. They only lost one man, and that was to a burst appendix, so there really wasn't anything they could do about that. And to have done that was just extraordinary for the time and place, to have 30, 40 men make it back and live. I do appreciate people who do things right, but it sometimes loses the drama, as you said. Is there anything else special about the book or the story that you really want to talk about?
Yeah, just the last thing I'd say that what makes the expeditions of the 1920s so different as well from modern ones is the kind of issue of communications. That now it's commonplace for people to be making telephone calls from the summit of Everest, tweeting from the summit of Everest. Certainly, you'd expect to have live transmissions going on from the base camp, but I think that people don't quite appreciate how utterly different it was in the 20s when messages are literally carried out, and the further that you get away from the nearest telegraph station, the longer it takes to get back, and because of this you get strange things starting to happen there, because one messenger may have hurt his leg and got ill. Messenger gets there more quickly, or you might have a couple of weeks when you've got no news at all, and then suddenly a week when you get all three expeditions, news of all three attempts coming in at the same time, and so that creates a very kind of strange atmosphere for the people who are back home trying to work out what's going on, because people disappear for a long time, and then suddenly you hear about it, and then you get confused because you've got one telegram which is coming back which says, "Oh well, we're all coming home now," and then the previous one which arrived the day before said, "Oh yeah, the third attempt is about to happen." That issue of the communications is so very different, and obviously the other thing it feeds into is weather forecasting. That now it is kind of taken as a given that you'll have very good weather forecasting for the Himalayas. It's obviously a difficult place to predict, and weather is rarely absolutely predictable. But basically, teams go to Everest now, and they're constantly looking at weather information. They look for what they call the best weather window, and in the best weather window, everybody tries to climb. That's why you get queues at the summit. It's not just because there are so many people at base camp. It's because there's so many people at base camp, all who want to go at the same time, because they've been told you've got 72 hours of good weather coming up. This is the optimum time to climb. Whereas in the 1920s and even up to the 1950s, there was a lot of suck it and see. The great enemy is the monsoon. That's going to bring loads of snow. It's going to make it really dangerous. And so you've got to try and get up before the monsoon arrives. But when is the monsoon going to arrive? Well, we don't know. Tea farmers in Darjeeling say that it usually arrives at this time, but sometimes it starts and then it stops for a couple of weeks, but we're not really sure, And this is the whole thing. This is constant fear of bad weather coming, and having to do things quickly in order to beat its arrival, but never sure when it is going to arrive. Whereas now, sophisticated communications technologies getting in sophisticated weather forecasts, which make life much more predictable. Not absolutely predictable, because often things go wrong and storms come in an unexpected way, but it really changes the game, because definitely the enemy in the 20s and 30s is the weather, and that's what really has an impact on whether you succeed or not.
I can't remember who it was in which expedition, but wasn't someone getting postcards or telegrams from his cousin or sister in Sri Lanka that was being sent up, and like the monsoon's here, it hasn't arrived, and they were, that's how they were figuring out where the monsoon was, by seeing where it was in Sri Lanka, which is just mind-boggling again when you think about it today. So I did have one last question, actually two last questions. One is a personal one for you. The other one, though, is when the avalanche happens at the end of the 1922 expedition. They're heading up to the North Pole, if I remember right, and Mallory's leading them, and there's fresh snow, and there's an avalanche, and 7 of the Sherpas die. I think one of the hardest things for a non-mountain person is to understand the why an avalanche like that. Why were those difficult conditions at that time, and were just set up for a disaster like that? Can you explain that a little bit?
Basically, avalanches are large amounts of snow, and so when there's a lot of snow, it increases the chances of an avalanche. And with the arrival of the monsoon, or the kind of front end of the monsoon, what it brings is lots of moisture into the Himalayas. The Himalayas are very cold, so the moisture condenses and falls as snow. And so the later you leave it, the more chance that you're going to have much more snow. But in particular, what is really dangerous is when you have layers of snow which has been frozen below, and then lots of fresh snow on top, because that is the kind of condition that if there's a sufficient accumulation of snow on top, then it's in a very precarious position. Avalanches happen on mountains without any people there. Avalanches don't just happen because somebody tries to cross a slope which is kind of heavily burdened with snow. They're kind of a natural occurrence, and snow accumulates and gets to a point where the angle of the slope is severe enough for it to start coming downhill, But if you're also happen to be trying to walk across a slope which is kind of burdened with this enormous amount of snow, and particularly if there's a cold layer underneath and a fresher layer on top, then that snow is liable to kind of break off. But the conditions in the Himalayas are kind of different from the conditions in Europe because of the topography and the climate, and so people hadn't had experience of this. They didn't really know. They didn't understand snow conditions, and so they just made a misjudgment in thinking that it was safe, and it wasn't.
My last question then, before we wrap up, do you have any plans for the future, for another book, or is there any subject or topic that you're aiming at, or not?
doing the story of the 1922 expedition got me interested in these characters, and their story doesn't end in 22, it kind of ends in 24. And so although my initial interest in the 22 expedition was because people hadn't really written quite so much about it in comparison with the 1924, kind of part of me feels I'd like to bring these characters to the end of the story, to Mallory to the end of the story, Bruce to the end of the story, what happened next with Finch. And so that's what I'm thinking about at the moment. I don't really want to go off and try and find Irving's body. Truth of the matter is that in 1924 it was an open question as to quite what had happened, and today it's an open question as to quite what had happened. There's a little bit more information available. Obviously, the finding of Mallory's body was a significant event, but I don't think people are any clearer or can be any more definitive about whether Mallory and Irving reached the summit or not now as they were then. So I don't think that's necessarily the only interesting issue there. And so I'm kind of interested in that and trying to finish this story, take them to the end of the line, what happened next.
Yeah, I kind of had that feeling when I did the Mallory series, and I just said, this is only part of the story. My title of the podcast was George Mallory and the Assault on Everest, and I followed it up with Hillary and Tenzing and the Conquest of Everest, because I almost see Everest as the overarching character of the story, because I was just like, we have to do that next step, and I wasn't planning on doing Tenzing and Hillary right after it, but I said I had to do it, because so I totally understand you wanting to finish up that story. Mick, I want to thank you very much for spending the last hour sitting with us and chatting about your new book, Everest 1922. It is out now. It's a great, I want to say, very geeky, history, nerdy kind of thing, because that's what I come from, and I love the detail and so forth that you find in the book, and I recommend people pick it up if they're interested in this kind of thing. But again, thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you. Nice to speak to you.
We've had Mick Conifray, the author of Everest 1922, the epic story of the first attempt on the world's highest mountain. I've had a great time. Thanks much. I want to again thank author Mick Conifray for taking part in this interview. He was a great sport and tackled every question I could at him. If you're interested in learning more about Everest 1922, there are links in the show notes, as well as on our website, explorerpodcast.com. So again, thanks to Mick Conifray. I hope you enjoyed. The Explorers Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Network. Go to airwavemedia.com to find other first-rate podcasts, including Art Smart and Legends of the Old West. It's Pittsburgh. I put a map of all this on our website, explorerspodcast.com. So what Nansen and others were suggesting was that if you let yourself get frozen into the ice at the right spot, the natural drift of the ice would take you close to the North Pole. Now, some really big questions here. First, this assumes that there is no solid land in the north, like at the South Pole, as a continent doesn't drift. But based on the information available, Nansen believed that the Arctic was only a frozen pack of ice, not a solid mass of land. Yes, there were some islands here and there, but the transpolar drift stream demonstrated nothing significant. Second, how long would it take to drift across the Arctic Ocean? I mean, the relics from the Jeanette had taken 3 years to reach Greenland. Was that normal? What if the time frame varied? What if a ship took 5 or more years? Third, as noted, exactly how close did the drift get to the North Pole? Again, a huge question. Any expedition would not only have to be frozen into the ice, but have to, at some point, probably strike out on foot across the Arctic ice cap to actually reach the pole. No one knew how far such a journey would be. Fourth, what if the whole transpolar drift theory was wrong? I mean, maybe the Jeanette relics got to Greenland in some other fashion. Well, if that was the case, that might do everyone who took part in such an endeavor. And finally, if you believe the transpolar drift stream theory was correct and were willing to live on the Arctic ice for 2, 3, 4 years, how can you manage that? Ships just didn't survive that long in the ice. The constant pressure they have to endure eventually crushes them. And this takes us back to Nansen's plan. He proposed building a small, strong ship that would not get crushed in the ice. And how was that possible? Well, in theory, the idea was to build a ship that would get pushed upward as the ice pressed in. Think of it this way. Let's say you have a bowl, one you use for eating cereal or soup. Let's put that bowl in a pond of water. As the pond freezes over, the ice forms around the bowl. The colder it gets, the thicker the ice gets. Over time, the ice presses harder and harder against the bowl. And when the pressure gets too much for the bowl, it does what? Well, in theory, it gets pushed upward. This is because of the curved shape of the bowl. The bowl isn't trying to resist the pressure of the ice. It's going with the flow, so to speak, and just slides upward as the ice pushes inward. When the ice melts, the bowl is lowered right back down into the water. Again, that's in theory. Nansen's proposal would generate all sorts of opinions. Some people thought it was absolutely nuts. They doubted the transpolar drift theory, and they said a person would be crazy to purposely get frozen into the Arctic ice. It was a disaster waiting to happen. No ship could withstand the pressure of the polar ice for such a long time. American polar explorer Adolphus Greely, whose team held the farthest north record at this time, would say the plan was, quote, an illogical scheme of self-destruction, end quote. But there were others who embraced Nansen's bold plan of using the forces of nature to execute his goals. Baron Oscar Dixon, a Swede, called Nansen's plan, quote, grand and brilliant, end quote. He was so enthralled by Nansen's ideas, he offered to finance the entire expedition, which would cost upwards of 300,000 krona. As a comparison, the total cost of Nansen's Greenland expedition was around 10,000 krona, or 1/30th of the price. Now, Nansen could have taken the money and been done, but as with his previous endeavor, he wanted this to be an extension of Norwegian nationalism. He was determined to make it an all-Norwegian affair, including the financing, if possible. The threat of foreign money would spur the Norwegian government into action. They would approve a grant of 200,000 krona for a polar expedition. The remaining 100,000 would be raised by private donations, and thus Nansen would get his Norwegian money. Next, he needed to get a ship, which was the most critical element of the entire expedition. For that, he returned to Colin Archer, one of Norway's most distinguished ship architects and builders. Archer was on the cutting edge of shipbuilding theory and was famous for making ships to exact specifications. Nansen would visit the man in Lavik, Norway in late 1890. Archer was hesitant to get involved, but curious about Nansen's idea. In the end, he would agree to build the vessel. The resulting ship would be unlike anything ever constructed. The ship, which would be named Fram, which means forward in Norwegian, was not large. It measured 128 feet long by 36 feet, 31.5 by 11 meters. The unique thing about the Fram was its rounded hull. A ship is naturally curved, but Fram was exceptionally so. The idea was that when the ice pushed in on the sloping sides of the ship, it would force the ship upward instead of just pressing against the hull and crushing it. As a note, the Fram still exists today. There's an entire museum in Oslo dedicated to the ship and polar exploration. I put a link to it on our site and in the show notes. I recommend taking a look. Anyhow, Colin Archer would put all of his thoughts and design skills into constructing Fram. The wood was critical. The keel was made of American elm, the frames of oak, grown to shape and 30 years aged. The stem, which is the curved edge stretching from the keel below up to the edge of the ship, was made of 3 massive oak timbers. The deck was of Norwegian pine, while the outer planking was double and made of oak. To top it off, the outer planking was sheathed in a layer of South American greenheart, one of the hardest timber types in the world. The ship's thickness ranged from about 2 to 2.5 feet, or 60 by 75 centimeters. But at the bow, which is the front of the ship, it was 4 feet thick, or 1.25 meters. Diagonal braces were used to reinforce the hull internally, and inside there were 3 layers of paneling, 2 filled with cork shavings, felt, and reindeer hair. This would give the ship extra insulation, which was critical for the survival of the men who would have to live on the ship for years. The Fram was rigged as a 3-masted schooner and had a state-of-the-art 220 horsepower engine capable of 7 knots. There was even a windmill to run a generator, which would provide lamps. The end result was a element was the ship's roundness. No matter how strong a ship is, it will eventually buckle under the power of the ice cap. The rounded hull would allow the ship to evolve with its environment and, hopefully, survive. It was really quite amazing, as there was no real established rules or examples to draw upon. I talk a lot about Fram because it's very important to our story, and I think it reflects Nansen's thought process. Remember on the Greenland expedition, he had used custom-designed sledges, skis, clothing, and other gear. He looked at his environment and worked to adapt to that world. So often humans try and do things the other way around, and it often means failure. So with the ship being constructed, Nansen would have a million other things to do to make the expedition a reality. He had to get provisions and gear, hire a crew, and solidify his plans. By the way, his goal was to set out in 1892, but delays would force him to wait until the following year. But before we get into the planning of the expedition, let's take a moment to talk about some things going on in Nansen's life. First item, Nansen would have other opportunities at this time. An Australian group asked him to lead an expedition to the South Pole. He felt it could easily be achieved using skis and dogs, and Nansen's experience on a snow-capped landmass would have made him a perfect leader. But he would pass, saying that the North Pole, due to its proximity, was the important goal for his nation. However, he did express interest in the South Pole expedition after the North Pole was conquered. His dream was to be the first man to both poles. Anyhow, one of the reasons for Nansen delaying his expedition by a year was money. He had a nice salary, but it was not that much. He and his wife had a new home, and he was constantly traveling. In all honesty, he was living beyond his means. As a result, he would hit the lecture circuit, at one point giving 21 lectures in 29 days. It made him some decent cash, but it was exhausting. Plus, Nansen found it boring. Telling the same stories over and over was not something a man like him wanted to be doing. Second item, his wife would give birth to a stillborn baby, casting a gloom over him and Ava's lives. Add in rumors of infidelity, and Nansen's home life was anything but calm. To be honest, Nansen and his wife would have a somewhat tortured relationship. Nansen was moody, naturally argumentative, and didn't like to compromise. She would work hard to manage his moods, but it wasn't always easy. The two relished each other's company, but travel and demands on Nansen kept him away, which upset both of them. Nansen was always writing to Ava and saying how much he missed her. It would send him into bouts of depression. As for Ava, she dreaded losing him. She had heard the rumors of his flings, and every time he traveled, those fears only grew. On the flip side, after recovering from a stillbirth, she got back into singing and started to give singing lessons. Also, whenever possible, she joined Nansen when he traveled, which helped both of them. However, one thing she dreaded was Nansen heading off on his expedition. She knew he would be gone for years. That idea scared both of them. Okay, let's put that stuff aside and get back to Nansen's proposed polar expedition.
Altair HyperWorks is the most complete solution for engineering simulation on the market. From mechanical to electrical to civil engineering, Altair has a solution for you. The best part is the Altair Units licensing model gives you full access to all of these tools at a lower cost of ownership. Reach out to True Insight, Altair's premier North American for more information. www.trueinsight.io. Hey Matt, did you know that wombats poop cubes?
Nope, never heard that before.
Did you know the unicorn is the national animal of Scotland?
I didn't know, nor do I care.
Neil, did you know that Liechtenstein is the only doubly landlocked country in Europe?
Jeff, isn't that an American pop artist?
Well, actually, it's both. If you want to learn things like that and more, join us each week on Triviality, a pub trivia-style game show podcast where a lack of seriousness meets a little bit of knowledge.
Week to answer general knowledge trivia alongside exciting guests from around the world.
And we're here too.
Join us every Tuesday for new hour-long episodes of Triviality. Plus, tons of extra themed content on everything from The Office and Lord of the Rings to science and geography.
And sometimes we even do sports.
Find us on all your preferred podcast apps and take part in the fun of playing bar trivia without the need to wear pants.
Real mature, Jeff. Forget it, Neil. It's Triviality.
Nansen's goal was to reach the North Pole. Here are the details of his plan. The team would consist of only about a dozen men, specialists at their jobs. Again, Nansen was eschewing the traditional approach of dozens or even hundreds of men on this kind of endeavor. Now, the initial idea was to sail all the way around South America and come up to the Bering Strait, just like the Jeanette had done a decade earlier. The idea was to follow in the footsteps of the ship. But Nansen would make a change to this part of the plan. His ship would instead sail up the Norwegian coast and go east and skirt along the Russian coastline. They would then reach where the Jeanette had been frozen in the ice, just from the opposite direction. That sounds logical, but I want to point out that only one ship had ever sailed that far east along the coast. That was the Vega under Adolf Nordenskjöld, who was the first person to complete the Northeast Passage, which we discussed previously. Anyhow, the idea was a good one, as long as the Fram could make it that far east, which wasn't a given as the ice was hard to predict. The ship would then make its way north and let itself get frozen in, and then they would wait. With luck, the drift would take the ship close to the North Pole. Just how close was a great question. No one knew for sure. No matter, Nansen was pretty sure he would have to get out onto the ice and make a crossing at some point. For that, he would bring along a sledge dog. The idea was that Nansen would use skis and dogs to make the dash to the pole. The ship would continue to float along with the drift, hopefully breaking out of the ice around Spitsbergen. As for Nansen and anyone else on the North Pole trek, well, once they turned around, they would have to cross the frozen ice to land, likely the collection of islands called Franz Josef Land. From there, they would make their way to Spitsbergen, which was frequented by whaling and fishing vessels. So that was the plan. The theories behind it all were sound, but they were still just theories. As I said, most people thought Nansen was a bit crazy to try such a thing, but as we have seen, the guy never lacked confidence. So Nansen would thus have to outfit his expedition and assemble his team. As with the Greenland expedition, he scoured through books and journals and tried to discern all he could from previous expeditions, anything for an edge. One of my favorite stories involved American polar explorer Robert Peary. If you recall, Peary had initially planned on crossing Greenland in 1888, but had been held up by the United States Navy with surveying work in Central America. Nansen had used that delay to launch his own expedition and steal Peary's thunder. While Peary was more than a little upset by Nansen's interloping on what he thought was his territory, he felt that since he had made an earlier reconnaissance mission, that gave him priority to do a crossing. That aside, Peary would eventually return to Greenland in 1891 and make a rather epic crossing much further north than Nansen's route. Peary would go across Greenland and back, traveling 4 times longer than Nansen. It was really quite amazing. And while everyone would praise Peary for what he had done, it stung that it was Nansen whose name was in the record book. Now, Peary had used dogs successfully on the crossing. Nansen would thus write to the man and ask him a bunch of questions about the experience. What had he thought of the dogs? What sledges had he used? What kind of food? That sort of thing. Perhaps it was a bit cheeky to go ask the guy who had just bested for advice, but it might have been that Nansen was oblivious to such niceties and traditions. Anyhow, Peary would ultimately respond, but he was clearly not thrilled. In his biography of Nansen, Roland Huntford wrote this, quote, Peary eventually replied that he stuck to pemmican as his staple diet and that his sledge was based on Nansen's model. His letter was curt and reserved. He saw Nansen as a deadly rival. He was consumed by resentment towards those who, as he considered, had forestalled him in his first crossing of Greenland and robbed him of his rightful due. End quote. By the way, Peary had his own designs on the North Pole and would ultimately claim the prize, but not for another decade and a half, and not without controversy. In the end, Nansen would work hard outfitting the expedition. As before, this was critical to him. He would pick and test the food, the clothing, the gear, pretty much everything. He actually loved the planning part of the expedition. He tested the rifles and guns and ammunition. He tried out all sorts of food options. For skis, he abandoned the telemark style, as he felt it was more for downhill skiing. He would ultimately bring 50 different kinds of skis to test on the ice cap. One fun thing was chocolate. In his book on the Greenland expedition, Nansen had written how wonderful the chocolate was that they had taken. It had been a great treat anytime it was eaten by the men. Well, the chocolate he had brought was made by Cadbury in England. The company was so thrilled by Nansen's poetic descriptions of their product, they gave him all that he requested for free. One other item I want to mention, as it is very important to this and future polar expeditions, was the Primus stove. The Primus had only been invented in 1892 by a Stockholm mechanic. It was, to be honest, revolutionary. It would be the first portable stove to efficiently burn liquid fuel, paraffin, and produce an intense heat. It was 5 to 6 times better than anything else on the market. Compact and portable, practically a miracle. It will be a staple on polar expeditions in the future, and Nansen was the first explorer to use it. And so, as the ship and supplies and gear was put together, Nansen would have to settle on a team. The ship would have a crew of 12. All would be men and Norwegians. Well, not quite all Norwegians, but we'll get to that in a moment. As second in command to Nansen, there was no question. It would be Otto Sverdrup, his loyal and dependable deputy from the Greenland expedition. He was the one man Nansen insisted on being on the team. Sverdrup had gotten married in 1891 and was hesitant about going, but Nansen agreed to have the man's wife taken financially if he didn't return. With that, Sverdrup was on board. Some other key team members included Theodore Jacobsen, who was an Arctic veteran who would be the ship's first officer. And then there was Sigurd Hansen, a naval lieutenant, who would conduct scientific observations. Henrik Blessing was the ship's doctor, and Hjalmar Johansson, an army reservist, was the dog handler. Johansson would be very important to our story later on. One of the men, second engineer Lars Peterson, would turn out to be Swedish. Once his nationality was discovered, he was allowed to stay, the only non-Norwegian on the expedition. Now, the list of people not brought on the expedition is interesting. This included 20-year-old Roald Amundsen, the first person to reach the South Pole. He had applied, but his mother had stepped in and stopped her son from going. Another fascinating person was English explorer Frederick Jackson. Now, Jackson would be turned down because he was not Norwegian, but remember him, because he was so keen to be part of a expedition, he would go off and organize his own enterprise. And he will pop up later in our story, so again, don't forget him. And finally, 2 men turned down for the expedition included the Sami from the Greenland expedition, Samuel Bautu and Ole Nilsen Ravna. Neither had the skill set needed for the journey, and in the case of Ravna, was too old. I do want to note that Nansen's team will, for a variety of reasons, change right up to the point of departing the last port in Norway. We will talk about that when it happens. I want to stress that all that I'm talking about, getting provisions and gear, hiring the team, building the ship, it was all happening at the same time over the course of 1891 through 1893. And that takes us back to Nansen's ship. The Fram would be launched in Lavik on October 6, 1892. Nansen's wife, Eva, would do the christening. The ship would be towed to Christiania, about 75 miles or 120 kilometers away. There, it would be fitted and ready for sail. All the preparations would be completed by April of 1893, and the first trials at sea went well. The ship could make 7 knots, and it was highly maneuverable. The round design did cause the ship to roll uncomfortably when in open sea, but that was an acceptable trade-off. All in all, Colin Archer's design and build had been outstanding, and everyone was thrilled with the results. And so Nansen and his crew prepared to set off on their epic journey. However, 2 issues would arise. The first was money. The expedition was over a budget, risen from 300,000 krona to almost 450,000. This would cause a bit of a scramble right before launch. Ultimately, the Norwegian government would pony up 80,000 more, and the rest would be raised from private sources. Oscar II, the King of Sweden and Norway, would donate 20,000 krona and visit the Fram while at Christiania. This and other donors would step up, alleviating the issue, but not until the last minute. The other problem was the dogs. Nansen had had difficulties obtaining sled dogs. He would ultimately settle on getting them from Russia. However, they had not arrived in Christiania and would instead have to be picked up on the Siberian coast. In fact, Nansen's contacts had arranged for 2 groups of dogs to rendezvous with the ship. Extra dogs were never a bad thing. All of this was troubling as it was something out of Nansen's control, and the dogs were an important part of his plan. He would just have to trust that everything would work out well. So that gets us up to June of 1893 as the Fram prepared to depart Christiania. For the 32-year-old Nansen, leaving now was a troubling proposition. His wife, Eva, had given birth to a baby, a girl, in January of that year. The idea of leaving his wife and infant daughter was almost unbearable. It put him in a dark mood much of the time. But there was not much that could be done about things at this point. The ship was ready, the men were ready. As a reminder, the ship would sail up the Norwegian coast and push toward Russia. The good part about this is that there were ports all along the coast, which meant they weren't quite heading off alone, at least not yet. On June 24, 1893, the Fram departed from Christiania. The ship would stop in Bergen for a spell before continuing up the coast. In reality, this part of the voyage was one long, drawn-out farewell. Fram would stop at various ports, each town celebrating their brave native sons as they headed out into the wild. On July 12th, the ship would reach Tromsø, a key port on the northern tip of Norway. It was a major center for whaling and sealing ships. A few things would happen here. First, some last-minute gear and supplies would be brought on board. This included boots, sleeping bags, and other clothing made by the Sami people, much of it from reindeer fur. Second, anyone on board not heading into the Arctic waters would depart. This included someone I have not mentioned in today's episode, and that is Christian Christensen, who had been on the Greenland expedition. Nansen had wanted Christensen, a dependable man, on this upcoming endeavor. And Christensen had seriously considered the offer and had traveled to Tromsø, still undecided as to what he was going to do. The idea of spending 3 or 4 years away from his home was not attractive, but the clincher was when he met with Nansen and spent some time with him and the team. Christensen realized that he could not endure years under Nansen's command. Nansen's inability to relate to others, especially men, was just too great an obstacle. He would thus pass on the offer, which stung Nansen, who had been counting on Christensen to be a reliable and dependable part of the team. The final item was that Nansen would have to add a couple of replacement crew members, including one to take Christensen's place. So, with things filled up, Nansen decided to leave Tromsø on the morning of July 14th. but he would have to delay departure for half a day because the men had went out the night before and got roaring drunk. On July 18th, the ship would reach Vardo, the last port of call in Norwegian territory, and the final bit of civilization on their itinerary. Nansen would get a telegram from his wife at the last moment. He would write her back saying, quote, "I kiss it in you 1,000 times and depart thinking of you with bright, cheerful thoughts," end quote. But honestly, bright, cheerful thoughts were not easy for Nansen. He knew he would not see his wife for several years, and he had an irrational fear that Ava would die while he was at sea. That thought put him in a dark frame of mind. Anyhow, the locals would give the men a big farewell party, but the men would, again, get wildly drunk. This forced the ship to delay the departure by another half a day. Once out at sea, Nansen unloaded on his crew. He never liked drinking that much, and he was furious at the men's behavior of the past few days. And it wasn't just the getting drunk part. It was delaying the ship's departure twice, and some of the men, while drunk, had stolen beer and food from the ship's stores. The rebuke was an unusually harsh one. The men were heading out into the ice, preparing for being away for years from their family and friends, not to mention risking their lives. That they went off as they did should not have been unexpected. Nansen's fury may have been related to the pressure of getting Fromm underway, and the anxiety of leaving behind his wife and young daughter. It put everyone on edge, and it was a sign of things to come. The truth is that Nansen understood little about these men, and they didn't understand much about him either. He was a self-righteous, argumentative, prickly jerk who thought he was better than all of them. Of course they disliked him. Anyhow, we will explore the relationship between Nansen and the crew in our next episode. And so the Fromm was underway on what would be a milestone voyage of polar exploration. The next step was to reach Siberia and pick up the dogs. After that, it was north into the Arctic Ocean, where the Fromm would be frozen in for a very long time. So that is it for today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. I want to say thank you to everyone who supports the show. Your contributions help make the Explorers podcast a reality. I want to thank our upper tier patrons, including Dave, Donnell, Fleur, Eric, Jesse, Robert, Rudy, Adam, Elizabeth, Andrew, Benjamin, Cameron, Catherine, Christopher, Collier, Craig, David, Michael, Eamon, Eileen, George, Gregory, Peter, Philip, Ralph, and all the rest of our patrons and donors. Thank you so very much. If you are interested in helping out the show financially, please visit explorerspodcast.com. Otherwise, thanks again for listening. Please join us next time for part 4 in our series on Fridtjof Nansen. I will see you then. Please take care. The Explorers Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Network. Go to airwavemedia.com to find other cool podcasts, including the Daily Meditation Podcast and The Constant.
Folks don't stop searching until they find the truth. And if you've got the eye of the detective, June's Journey is the game for you. Play as June Parker in a gripping murder mystery adventure as you find hidden objects to help solve her sister's death. You'll hunt for clues in hundreds of beautifully illustrated scenes set in the roaring 20s. With more than 1,000 scenes filled with clues, there's always something new to discover. You may even travel across the globe for your next lead. Every week, new chapters are added with new characters to meet and places to search. Plus, there are tons of fun, unique features to keep you entertained. From building your own island estate with expansive gardens and beautiful buildings, to collecting scraps of information on each character to fill your photo album. You can even play with or against other players by joining a detective club. Find your first clue by downloading June's Journey today. Available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games.
Prepare to enter an immersive world of tragedies, hauntings, legends, and folklore. Southern Gothic is a podcast that will take you deep into the dark history and haunted lore of the American South, exploring some of the region's most infamous tales. From the swamps of Louisiana to the shores of the Carolinas, isolated communities of Appalachia, and the bloody battlefields and earliest settlements of Virginia. This is where ghost stories come alive, grim secrets are exposed, and mysteries, well, you need to listen to find out. Join us now at southerngothicmedia.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast. folks don't stop searching till they find the truth. And if you've got the eye of a detective, June's Journey is the game for you. Play as June Parker in a gripping murder mystery adventure as you find hidden objects to help solve her sister's death. You'll hunt for clues in hundreds of beautifully illustrated scenes set in the roaring 20s. With more than 1,000 scenes filled with clues, there's always something new to discover. You may even trek across the globe for your next lead. Every week, new chapters are added with new characters to meet and places to search. Plus, there are tons of fun, unique features to keep you entertained. From building your own island estate with expansive gardens and beautiful buildings, to collecting scraps of information on each character to fill your photo album. You can even play with or against other players by joining a detective club. Find your first clue by downloading June's Journey today. Available on Android and iOS, as well as on PC through Facebook Games.
Hello, everyone. This is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. For the next couple of months, we are conducting a listener survey to help us get to know you, your interests, and what you think of the show. You can help out the podcast by taking a short questionnaire at surveymonkey.com/r. That's the letter R. So surveymonkey.com/r/airwave. This only takes a few minutes, and your feedback will help us improve the Explorers Podcast and find new sponsors who actually interest you. In the survey, there's even a place at the end where you can tell me anything you want. Plus, as my way of saying thank you, every person who fills out the survey will be entered to win a $500 Amazon gift card. So please, if you could take the survey, I would appreciate it. That's surveymonkey.com/r/airwave, or click on the link in our episode notes of our more recent episodes. There's also a link on our website's homepage, explorerspodcast.com. Thank you again for your help. Hello, and welcome to the Explorers Podcast. Today is part 4 in our series on Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen. Last time, we left Nansen as his ship departed from the northern settlement of Vardø, Norway, bound for the Siberian coast. They were now truly in the wilderness. But before we set off with Nansen, there is one note for today. Go to our website, explorerspodcast.com, for a map of Fridtjof's journey. It will very much help you understand the specifics of Nansen's expedition. That is it for notes. Let's get going. It was late July of 1893. Fromm traveled east along the Russian coast, aiming for the remote outpost of Karbarova, where the team would pick up dogs for the expedition. From there, they would continue east and bring on a second batch of dogs at the mouth of the Olenyok River. After that, they would head north to the approximate location where the Jeanette had been crushed in the ice over a decade before. At that point, the Fromm would be iced in and taken by the transpolar drift to the North Pole. Nansen didn't expect to be carried right to his goal, but close enough that he could lead a team, on skis and using dogs, to the pole. The journey would take at least 2 years, probably more. The ship, the Fromm, had been specially built for the expedition. It had a crew of 12, although Sverdrup was the expedition's second in command. The Fromm departed Vardø on July 21st in the early morning hours. Many of the men had gotten drunk the night before, and Nansen lit into them for their actions. So, it was the summer of 1893, and Fromm would push east. The expedition would cross the Barents Sea, reaching Novaya Zemlya, a big island off the Russian mainland. They would arrive at the settlement of Karbarova on July 29th. It had been a roughly 700-mile, or 1,130-kilometer, voyage from Vardø. Waiting for the Norwegians were the dogs. The sled dogs had been procured by a Latvian agent, Alexander Trondheim. He had bought 40 dogs from Siberian tribesmen, although Nansen had asked for only 30. The reason was that sled dogs led hard lives. Disease and illness, as well as fighting with other animals and each other, was commonplace. Trondheim would lead the dogs across the Ural Mountains, following the reindeer herds of the area's nomadic tribes. It was a winding journey that had taken 6 months. 34 of the 40 dogs would survive the journey. For the dogs, the expedition hadn't even started yet, and 6 were already dead. They had reached Karbarova on July 10th and had been waiting for Nansen. Karbarova was a desolate and bleak place. 2 churches dominated a small settlement. It was inhabited only in the summer by tribesmen and Russian traders. A few things to note. 1. Ice was already appearing in the area, an ominous sign. 2. The expedition was expecting a load of coal to be delivered to Karbarova, but it had not yet arrived. 3. The Fram was experiencing mechanical issues as the steam pipes of the engine leaked, causing the boiler to fail. Also, the bilge pump broke. Repairs were being made at this time. 4. Despite the problems, the Fram had performed well. It was nimble and quick, and it was strong, able to push aside ice floes as needed. 5. To the east was the Igers Strait, which led into the Kara Sea. Few ships had ever gone to this region. Nansen would take a motorboat to the entrance of the Kara Sea and find heavy ice. However, the coastal area was clear. The Fram needed to get through the Kara Sea, which was about 1,000 miles wide or 1,600 kilometers. From the Kara Sea, you could sail into the Laptev Sea, which leads to the New Siberian Islands. North of those islands was where the Jeanette had gone down the nation. The big fear was that the ice would form early in the Kara Sea and block the way east. As a note, only one ship had ever managed to sail into the Laptev Sea from the Kara Sea, so this was no simple thing. And so Nansen and his crew prepared to head into Realm's rare adventure. Alexander Trondheim, the man who was impressed by Fram, the crew, and Nansen. Of our Norwegian explorer, he noted his commanding presence, plus his willingness to work hard and set a good example. He said that when coal was being hauled to the boiler room, a hard and dirty job, Nansen took part. However, despite Trondheim's praise, there was, without question, a barrier between Nansen and the rest of the crew. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The Fram, engines repaired, would wait until August 3rd before departing Karbarova. The dogs would be kenneled on the deck of the ship, except for one, the Vike, which had been brought from Norway. She roamed the ship freely and was Nansen's favorite. The other dogs had to be kept apart, as they would fight viciously with one another if given the chance. As for the coal Nansen had been waiting for, well, it never arrived, and while it was a setback, it wasn't critical to the mission. Before sailing, Nansen had been able to write some final letters, including one to his wife. He included some flowers he had picked from the Siberian plain. He wrote to Ava that he hoped to be home in 2 years, but to his brother Alexander, he said it would likely be at least 3 years, perhaps as long as 5. Fram would sail east, disappearing into the fog, the vessel's last contact with civilization. The ship would pass through the Igers Strait and into the Kara Sea. The ice, fog, and unknown waters put everyone on edge. Fram would sail wherever the water and ice allowed them. Through channels of open ice or along the coast, the ship went steadily east, although not necessarily in a straight line. And I want to note that the ship often had to turn around when the ice closed in, forcing them to retrace their steps. Through it all, Fram proved to be everything she was made out to be. She was quick and maneuverable, as well as powerful. However, on August 6th, the ship would be stopped by the fog and ice. Fram would not move for 3 days. But things would clear up and press onward, reaching open water a few days later. In fact, things went so well, the ship would be able to sail east at a speed of 5 knots and just using the sails. On August 16th, Fram rounded the Yamal Peninsula. A couple of days later, they sighted an island, the first discovery of the expedition. The island was dubbed Sverdrup Island, as it was the expedition's second-in-command who had sighted it. And there would be more discoveries as the Fram zigzagged its way east through the ice. One place was named after Clements Markham, the president of the Royal Geographical Society. Another was named after Adolf Nordenskjöld, the Scandinavian explorer who had been the first to complete the Northeast Passage. Fram would continue to press east, but with each day, the ice thickened and snow began to fall. In the beginning of September, the ship would get stuck in the ice for 4 days. Frankly, the journey across the Kara Sea, which was shallow and known to be choked with ice, was touch and go on more than one occasion. Many of the men felt they wouldn't escape the clutches of the sea and get frozen in until spring. And then on September 9th, the men would sight a wide stretch of water. Nansen ordered the ship to ram its way through the ice, and in short order, the Fram was in open sea. The next day, she rounded Cape Chelyuskin, the entrance to the Laptev Sea. Fram was only the second ship, after Nordenskjöld's Vega in 1878, to enter the Laptev Sea in such a fashion. It was a great moment for Nansen and the entire crew. They had passed a major obstacle. Nansen would call the men together and fire off the ship's cannon to mark the moment. He would then declare a celebration, even breaking out the alcohol, something he didn't often do. The ship would then head to the mouth of the Onlyo River to collect the second batch of dogs. From there, it was further east and north to the New Siberian Islands. Fram continued to skirt along the coast of Siberia, but when they came to the region around the Onlyo River, the ice was thick, had an unpredictable currents and unknown shoals, and it was too risky to try and press onward. Nansen ordered the ship off. He would have loved to have had the second pack of dogs, but the uncharted waters, in conjunction with the ice, were just too dangerous. The Fram thus headed northeast toward the New Siberian Islands. The Laptev Sea was much deeper than the Kara Sea, so there was a lot less ice pack to contend with. This allowed them to make good progress. Nansen now wanted to get north of the New Siberian Islands. This equated, roughly, with 80-degree north latitude. He needed the ice to hold off just a little longer to reach his goal. Luck would not be Nansen's friend. The ice would thicken, especially to the north and east. Then, on September 20th, Nansen would write, quote, "Ahead lay the edge of the ice, massive and tight-packed, gleaming in the fog," end quote. The Fram could go no further. The northeast, which was where Nansen had wanted to reach, was blocked by solid ice. Faced with an impassable option to the east, Nansen decided to push northwest, where the ice wasn't yet completely packed tight. This would take the Fram further away from the current that Nansen had expected, but he decided that getting further north was the most important thing at this point. In reality, it would not matter too much, and that's because within a day, the ice closed in around Fram. To the men, it seemed inevitable that this would be where the ship would get iced in for the future. On September 28th, the dogs were transferred to the ice, and then about a week later, the rudder of the ship was raised to prevent it from being damaged by the encroaching ice. Seeger Scott Hansen, the expedition science officer, would say this at the moment, quote, "Now we are well and truly moored for the winter," end quote. The position was 78 degrees 49 minutes north. Nansen had wanted to reach the 80th parallel, and he was a little west of his desired location, but it would have to do. Now the men in the ship were at the mercy of the ice pack. On October 9th, the ice would press in and put Fram under real pressure for the first time. Of it, Nansen would say, quote, "A great commotion began and the whole ship trembled," end quote. The noise and the shaking was unnerving, many of the men experiencing such a thing for the first time. But Fram performed beautifully, exactly as expected. The ice slid cleanly beneath the rounded hull, lifting her up a few feet. As the pressure eased, the ship would settle down and break through the ice. Nansen was thrilled by the success of Colin Archer's design and construction, but it was just the beginning. Groans and creaks and rumbles would continue for days, but each time the Fram would be pushed up and then settle down. The ice just couldn't grip the hull. On October 25th, the expedition would see the last of the sun. The Arctic night was upon them. The ship had a windmill, which powered a generator, which powered a set of electric lamps. The lights were strung throughout the ship, and while they were weak, especially compared to today's lights, they were a much appreciated amenity. As we've seen on any expedition that spends a winter in the polar regions, the darkness can be oppressive, even debilitating. The small lamps that ran through the ship kept the gloominess at bay, even if just for a bit. Fram would move with the ice pack, but not necessarily in one direction. As we've talked about, ice packs are unpredictable. They are subject to the tides and currents, which were unknown to Nansen and his team, and thus the Fram would drift in all sorts of directions, north, south, east, west, and everything in between. If you look at the map of Fram's route, it is nothing at all like a straight line. By November 19th, the Fram would actually be further south than when she had been frozen in. But now, the biggest issue facing the men of Fram was boredom, plus the prospect of not seeing their homes for 2 or 3 or 4 years. To battle the gloom, the ship maintained a standard watch, and duties were assigned and completed in a regular fashion. Scientific readings were taken, laundry was done, repairs were made. The idea was to keep the men occupied and engaged. Also, each man on the ship had to undergo a medical exam every month under the eye of the ship's doctor, Henrik Blessing. Each man was tested for anemia and watched for signs of scurvy. The latter was a common problem on polar expeditions. At the time, no one knew that scurvy was caused by a lack of vitamin C, but it was known that certain foods helped battle the disease. This included oranges and limes. The latter, limes, had been a staple on English ships for 100 years. And that, my friends, is why Brits are often called limeys by Americans. However, the Scandinavians had a scurvy-fighting solution that dated back to the days of the Vikings. This was the Arctic cloudberry. The cloudberry was only found in the northern regions of Scandinavia, and it was rich in vitamin C. Nansen had been told by the explorer Adolf Nordenskjöld that he had brought cloudberries on his Vega expedition, and so Nansen, for his own endeavor, had purchased a half-ton of cloudberry preserves. Nansen had not thought the cloudberries to be the key to fighting scurvy. He actually believed that scurvy was a bacterial infection and went on the theory that a variety of foods was essential to keeping the disease at bay. As such, Nansen had brought more than 50 kinds of tinned foods. Many of these items, such as red cabbage, were high in vitamin C, if fresh. but when you can food, it destroys much of the nutritional value. Luckily for Nansen, he had brought the cloudberry preserves, and it would save the men from scurvy. The ship, by the way, was well outfitted with food. Oddly, Nansen had not brought along a dedicated cook. We have seen in other stories about polar exploration how important a smart and innovative chef can be to the crew of a ship. To not be prepared in the same fashion for months, even years, was critical to the morale of the men. The crew had enough problems already, and you didn't want them constantly grumbling about them. Luckily for Nansen, a few of the men would emerge as cooks and bakers, and the variety of foods he had brought helped avoid such discontent. Side note here, years ago, I got to spend a night on a docked World War II era submarine with my son. We did a tour of the sub, and the guide told us that, with regards to the health of the crew, the two most important people were the doctor and the cook. The doctor was understandable, but why the cook? Well, the cook touched everything and everyone. If the cook got sick, it was the easiest way for something to spread throughout the rest of the crew. And thus the cook and the doctor were always the cleanest of anyone on a submarine. Side note done. And this takes us to another item that I mentioned earlier, and that's Nansen's relationship with the rest of the crew. As I said before, Nansen had little in common with most of the men of the throng. These were sailors and outdoorsmen and military men. He was an academic and a scientist, and prickly and moody. Sir Good Scott Hansen, the chief science officer and navigator, wrote this about the boss. Quote, "He is an odd character, sometimes serious, scientific, and aggressive in discussions, and then one fine day extravagantly cheerful and pleasant." End quote. He said that Nansen wanted to be the dominant alpha male. Doing so, he just came across as an insufferable know-it-all. And even worse was Nansen's inability to listen to others. In the diaries of the crew, this is a common frustration. If it wasn't Nansen's idea, it wasn't right. And if someone had a suggestion, he just won't listen. For the most part, the men just wished that Nansen would leave them to the work, but he was aware. Scott. And that brings us to a second point, and that is Otto Sverdrup, the expedition's second in command. Sverdrup was a quiet and stolid man. Although he displayed little emotion, people said he had a unique sense of humor that would emerge in quieter moments. Sverdrup had Nansen's trust, and more importantly, he knew how to do things without threatening Nansen's status as the ship's top dog. And he had the natural ability to work with the rest of the crew. Nansen, he did not let his emotions erupt in the heat of the moment. He was an even, trusted, and calming presence, which was sorely needed on the ship to counter Nansen's mercurial nature. Roland Humford, in his biography of Nansen,